Welcome, everybody. I'm Sarah Eberweis-Stein, the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Director of the L&D Leve Center for Jewish Studies. And I'm thrilled to welcome you to our final event of the academic year, a year in which the Leve Center staff and community has exercised heroism in maintaining a dedication to programming online. And I want to begin by offering my warmest thanks to Vivian and Raina and Caroline and David Wu, who have done a marvelous job of not only keeping us afloat, but of turning this year of duress into a year of success. Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to welcome you to New Approaches to Boyle Heights, a conversation, and to offer some words of introduction. I want to begin with a land acknowledgement statement by acknowledging that as a land grant institution, UCLA occupies the ancestral and unceded territory of the Tongvar peoples. We pay our respects to elders and relations, past, present, and emerging, and recognize the dispossession of Indigenous peoples is ongoing, and that land acknowledgements have frequently become empty gestures of inclusion. The Tongva people are still here, as is the movement for Indigenous sovereignty, and we are going to include in the chat links to some sites where members of our community can learn more and support the work being done on campus. This event is wonderfully celebrating two launches: the launch of a digital exhibit created by the Leve Center with Caroline Luce as head curator, and the launch of a book by George Sánchez, one of our guests. And I want to begin now by introducing those wonderful novel enterprises and our luminary guests. And before I do so, I will say that we are incredibly grateful to the Forward for being a co-sponsor for today's event, and to Rob Eshman for joining us. And I will have more words of introduction on him momentarily. First, a quick history on the Leve Center's commitment to working on the topic of Boyle Heights and engaging with the neighborhood of Boyle Heights, past and present. The digital exhibit that we are here to discuss, which Caroline Luce will delve into momentarily in great detail, was initially made possible by a generous gift from Alan D. Leve, who was raised in Boyle Heights, committed to ensuring that scholars and students will not forget the history and significance of the neighborhood so dear to him. Mr. Leve donated funds to create the Hinda and Jacob Schoenfeld Boyle Heights Collection, a research and teaching archive of artifacts and materials related to the neighborhood of Boyle Heights. Named in honor of his Romanian-born grandparents who moved to Boyle Heights in 1925, the Schoenfeld Boyle Heights Collection will become a physical archive at the UCLA Library and also hosts public history programs, including lectures, exhibitions, tours, and courses addressing the history of Jewish Los Angeles. The first of these public programs was a landmark exhibition called From Brooklyn Avenue to Cesar Chavez, Jewish Histories in Multiethnic Boyle Heights, which was launched in November of 2016 at UCLA's Royce Hall, which you see behind me so as to mask my messy study. The exhibition has since installed at the Breed Street Shul in Boyle Heights, and portions of the exhibition were also displayed in Los Angeles's City Hall as part of the city's first Jewish American Heritage Month celebration in 2017. The exhibit was subsequently reinstalled at the Breed Street Shul and then at the Boyle Heights History Studios, where it is currently available for viewing, and we'll provide in the chat a link to this institution. We are, as I said, here to showcase the launch of a second exhibition, this one a digital exhibition, created by lead curator, Leve Center Associate Director Caroline Luce, one of our featured speakers today. Dr. Luce has, for a decade now, served as the chief digital curator of Mapping Jewish LA, an ambitious digital project of the digital humanities. She received her PhD in history from UCLA with a focus on immigration, labor, and working class culture in the American West, and is working on a book manuscript entitled Yiddish in the Land of Sunshine, Jewish Radicalism, Labor, and Culture in Los Angeles, 1900 to 1950. We are at the center enormously indebted to Caroline's research, innovation, generosity to our center, and service not only to our center and UCLA, but the broader Los Angeles community. I also want to mention that the digital exhibit was the work of many hands as well, including designer David Wu, exhibit illustrator Eric Sheslow, aka Shez, editor Katie Von de Poot, and contributors Guillermo Avias Rodriguez, Jonathan Bonfil, Shmuel Gonzalez, Maxwell Greenberg, Kristen Hayashi, Albert Kocha Fum, and Rachel Trombetta. And we thank them all for their contribution. Now, as I said, and this is a long introduction only because our event is filled with so many luminary celebrations and individuals, we are also gathering today to celebrate a new book, very fresh off the press, by George Sánchez, who I would like to introduce. And first to tell you that the book is newly available for purchase at local sellers Skylight Books and Espacio 1739 in Boyle Heights. George Sánchez is a professor of American Studies and Ethnicity and History at the University of Southern California and an award-winning scholar of Mexican American history and immigration. He is the author of Becoming Mexican American, Ethnicity, Culture, and Identity in Chicana, Los Angeles, published by Oxford in 1993, and the book that has only just hit our independent local bookstores, Boyle Heights, How a Los Angeles Neighborhood Became the Future of American Democracy, published, as I said, in 2021 by the University of California Press. He's also the author of numerous edited volumes and published articles. He is the director of the USC Center for Diversity and Democracy and a renowned mentor who runs the USC Mellon Mays undergraduate fellowship program and has placed 45 former PhD students in tenure track positions throughout the United States. And I think that my colleague Genevieve Carpio, who I'll introduce in a moment, I believe may be among them. Dr. Sanchez served as the first Vice Dean for Diversity at Dornsife College at USC, where he initiated a first-generation student initiative, as well as programs for foster care youth in college. A former president of the American Studies Association, of the Pacific Coast branch of the American Historical Association, and immediate past president of the Organization of American Historians, he has received the first ever Equity Award for Excellence in Recruiting and Retaining Underrepresented Populations in the Historical Profession from the American Historical Association. The feathers in his cap are many, including the Outstanding Latina Faculty in Higher Education Research Institutions Award from the American Association of Hispanics in Higher Education, and the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Immigration and Ethnic History Society. Perhaps even equally important for our purposes today, Dr. Sanchez was born in Boyle Heights of two immigrant parents from Mexico and is a first-generation college student, receiving his bachelor's degree from Harvard College in 1981 and his doctoral degree from Stanford University in 1989. George, congratulations on your book and welcome. Additionally, we have two moderators joining us today, Rob Eshman from The Forward, national editor of The Forward, who was kind enough to work with us on launching this program for our shared broad communities. Prior to serving The Forward, he was editor-in-chief and publisher of the Jewish Journal of Los Angeles, where he wrote several features on Boyle Heights. And it has been very generous in helping us at the Leve Center open some of our innovative research endeavors to a broader community. Last but certainly not least, Dr. Genevieve Carpio is assistant professor of Chicana, Chicanos, and Central American Studies at UCLA, where she works on questions related to relational racial formation, the urban humanities, and 20th century US history. She holds a PhD in American Studies and Ethnicity, a master's in urban planning, and a graduate certificate in historic preservation. She has published in American Quarterly, Journal of American History, Journal of Urban Affairs, and Information Community and Society, among other venues. Carpio is author of Collisions at the Crossroads, How Place and Mobility Make Race, published in 2019 by UC Press, which received the Owens Book Award from the Western Historical Association and honorable mention from the National Association of Chicana Studies. I am simply delighted to welcome you all to the Leve Center's last event of the year, and thank you so much for your participation. And I believe I extend the virtual podium now to Dr. Carpio to lead us off.
Hello, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm really excited to be here in this group, but also to have this conversation about Boyle Heights. Those from Boyle Heights or Los Angeles or California may know this as a very vibrant Los Angeles neighborhood. And a lot of us think that we know this place well. Mariachi Plaza is a major transit spot, it's a cultural hub, and it's become the center of debates about gentrification. But looking at your projects shows us there is so much more to know. So I wanted to start off by asking, what are some of the misperceptions about Boyle Heights and memory around this community that your projects aim to address?
You want me to go first, Caroline? Well, one of the places that my project starts is a recognition that multiracial communities are actually the norm in the United States. And most historical work has taken as the norm single ethnic communities, barrios, ghettos of various sorts in various places. And the more I look into this in American history, not just in Los Angeles, but in other places, I note that the multiracial is actually much more common. And sometimes that's hidden from us, even when it's right in front of us. So I like to remind people today that, for example, Koreatown is majority Latino residential. And again, if you go through the streets, you wouldn't necessarily know that, but it is in all kinds of surveys. South Los Angeles is not just a prime African-American community, but it's been majority Latino for a long time. This is always happening in American urban life. And I think the work that I did in Boyle Heights really indicates that this was the norm in the 20th century. It's changed now, it's overwhelmingly Latino, but that doesn't mean that the period that it was multiracial is not actually much more common than we give credit for it in Boyle Heights history, but also in Los Angeles and in urban history in the United States overall. Therefore, we have to ask our questions about how do we define an ethnic community? What does it mean when we say something is a Jewish community or is a Latino community or is an African-American community, when in fact, so many of our communities are racially mixed? And that's, for me, a central misconception in terms of urban life that I'd like to, that I address in this book.
Yeah,
George,
thank you for that.
Oh, sorry. This is, I guess, for George and Caroline, but for Jews, we do have this idea in our mind of Boyle Heights as kind of this American shtetl. And one thing that I loved in this exhibit, which I really encourage everybody to click on and look at, is it was so not that, but could you talk about what was the actual percentage of Jews in the Boyle Heights population, and how did they get there?
Yeah, totally. So just picking up on what George is describing here, that's kind of a central goal of Mapping Jewish LA, is to really ask the question, what makes a neighborhood Jewish? What do we mean when we say something is a Jewish neighborhood? And so the two sort of interventions of this exhibit are really revealed in the title of the exhibit. The first half of which is Jewish Histories, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we want to think about is that people's responses to what makes a neighborhood Jewish often reflect their own sense of Jewish identity, their own sense of Jewish engagement. What's the most salient and important aspect of that for them? So you'll hear it was the center of Orthodox life, or you'll hear it's the center of secular Yiddish life, or you'll hear it's the center of Hamish shtetl sort of culture and community. And part of this exhibit is to show it was all of those things and more. There were many different Jewish histories that converged in this neighborhood. And we try to represent the full diversity and breadth of Jewish life that unfolded there. The second half of it was, of course, in keeping with George's point, to illuminate the multi-ethnic context in which that came. So often the way that Boyle Heights is described is to point to images or symbols of Jewish communities elsewhere. So you just mentioned the shtetl or the Lower East Side of Los Angeles. And our work at Mapping Jewish LA is really designed to understand LA on its own terms. And one of the ways to do that is to think about the specific multi-ethnic landscape that is formed on the Pacific Rim that differs from the Lower East Side significantly. So even at its peak in the 1930s, when the Jewish community in Boyle Heights was its largest, it was the most dense, highest concentration of Jews west of Chicago in the 1930s. That diversity was unfolding in an incredibly multi-ethnic context where Jews only comprised about 40% of the neighborhood's population. I did some census research as part of this project and found 43 different countries of origin converging in the neighborhood. And so it's that interplay between the sort of local and the transnational that we're trying to capture here. Where's the LA of this story and where's the Jewish of this story? But to specifically answer your question, Rob, most of the Jews who settled in Boyle Heights were either themselves or the descendants of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, what's generally recognized as the Pale of Settlement, the western borderlands of the Russian Empire, comprising present-day Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, Poland, Moldova, that sort of swath in the middle. There were some Sephardic Jews, which is to say Jews from the Eastern Mediterranean and North Africa who settled in Boyle Heights, but primarily this was an Ashkenazi community and often an immigrant community, although I will say that very few of the Jewish immigrants who settled in Boyle Heights came to LA directly from Europe. So most had spent some time elsewhere. One of the phenomenons George and I talk about a lot is the sort of state clubs. So there were not only Landsmannschaft groups associated with towns and cities in Eastern Europe, but also a Cleveland club and a Chicago club and a Manhattan club, right? So it's that kind of layers of identity and the acculturation that comes with some time spent in the United States that is also something that distinguishes Boyle Heights from those industrial port cities of the East in terms of its immigrant dynamics.
Zoom's a little awkward because I don't know when you want to chime in, Genevieve. So just don't be shy. And if the people watching this, if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A, not the chat, and we could get to your questions. But one of the things that was mind blowing about this was the early history of Boyle Heights, and I thought briefly, George, if you could talk about Boyle Heights wasn't born Jewish, so to speak, and or Latino or Japanese. It was actually this incredibly wealthy, upscale, kind of Beverly Hills-ish estate neighborhood, which I think that history has been obliterated. Could you kind of talk about how Boyle Heights became this working class neighborhood?
Sure. In the late 19th century, as Boyle Heights was being laid out as a urban community, it followed the path of so many other Los Angeles communities in that the developers really wanted to attract a white Protestant upper class migrant. And that was the pattern for almost all communities, Pasadena, Santa Monica, everywhere. That meant, and you can see that most obviously along Boyle Avenue, very large homes, the Victorian homes, and you see that basically around the entire rim of downtown Los Angeles, near USC, up Hoover, over in near Dodger Stadium. All of the areas that were the first suburbs all have this kind of Victorian homes that still dominate. And what happened was that there was a battle for these migrants, and some places went out. I in the book contrast what happened in Boyle Heights to what happened in Pasadena, where a group of developers from Indiana came and immediately laid out Orange Grove Avenue, put palm trees down. Before the turn of the century, had a parade, the Rose Parade, and they were very successful in attracting these kinds of migrants to Pasadena. They had the advantage that they could create a city that was separate from the city of Los Angeles, and having a city of Pasadena allowed them to move more quickly. Los Angeles itself, being larger, sort of lumbered along. It was later to build the bridges over the river, which were incredibly important. Didn't get as much water, services, paving of roads, all those things that were delayed in Boyle Heights, which basically made the developers, even though they were doing their best to try to bring people, you see what's now called the Mariachi Hotel in Mariachi Plaza, was constructed in 1879 to actually bring in people who might buy property to build their own homes. So that's one of the early ramifications of this. But what would happen is that essentially other places beat out Boyle Heights. And then as migration of some of these middle class Midwesterners, people from the East came in, they tended to go to the west, in particular towards the beach. A lot of places were laid out at that point in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And Boyle Heights increasingly, and the developers there increasingly recognized that that was not going to be the future of Boyle Heights. And at the same time, the industry of Los Angeles started to develop along the river, the flats area. And all of a sudden, you had the possibility that Boyle Heights should be partitioned in a different way. So land was cut up in smaller areas. Houses were built that were more applicable to a working class population. And so it began to attract both middle and lower class working people. Now, the other big thing that happened at this time was that all these other areas that were developing, from Pasadena to Santa Monica, all over the western part of Los Angeles, developed racially restrictive covenants as they were built, which meant that it was prohibited that they be sold or occupied by usually by non-Caucasians. And that had very broad terms in the early 20th century. Not only meant African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, but it also often meant Jews, Italians, Armenians, other people that were not seen as complete Caucasian in the early 20th century. That meant that for a lot of working people that came into Boyle Heights, it was open and it was close to many of these industrial jobs that were developing in the garment industry, in the food packing industry, and in various smaller industries near downtown. So that's where people went when they were working class. It was one of the first African-American neighborhoods in Los Angeles. It was basically open to all, and therefore developed a multiracial character from the very start.
And I would just add, I often describe this as a collision of aspirations, right? On the one hand, you have people like William Workman, who owned land in the neighborhood, were eager to see a return on their investment, right? They purchased this land with every intention of subdividing it and development. And Workman himself ended up running for mayor of Los Angeles because he got so frustrated with the very delays George is describing, right? He's like, we need roads, we need water. They're advocating for that. At the same time, you have the sort of city fathers whose ambitions for industrial development and growth of the Los Angeles economy drive zoning and land use policies. First, in 1908, LA becomes the first city in the entire country to have a master plan for how it's going to do land use. That's the moment where the Alameda corridor is essentially established. Everything south of Alameda is zoned for industrial use. That's when you start to see that industrial development around the railroad tracks that George is talking about. You start to see brickyards and canneries go up in the flats in Boyle Heights. And then you have the aspirations of the residents themselves, right? Who are coming to Los Angeles, to California for a slice of that dream that the boosters of the city are offering. You know, you come here, you can have your own home, you can have your own orange groves, you can have a taste of the good life. And so the covenants are by 1910s in full swing. By the 1920s, 90% of LA's housing stock is governed by a restrictive racial covenant. So there's that exclusion, but there's also this aspiration, right? And people like Workman are selling their land saying, for $600, you can buy your own plot. You can have this beautiful view of downtown. Come and get it. So I think it's really important, and this speaks to some of the misperceptions that you referenced, Jen, is that, you know, people wanted that ideal. They were coming here to seize that ideal, and Boyle Heights provided that space for them. We often think, oh, it's a sort of, you know, it's a barrio that was this awful place to live. But I can tell you in the Yiddish language records, that's not what's represented. What's represented is a lot of sort of, this is pleasant and lovely, and oh, the orange blossoms, and this sort of medicinal environment.
You were saying there were Yiddish poems written about extolling Boyle Heights. What was the title of one of them, you said?
Yeah, well, I can put it in the chat in a second, but it's Joseph Katsunogi talking about palm trees being cut down to build cottages with fresh cut green lawns. There's another poem by a guy named Lun Mates describing a lonely troubadour sitting on the street corner who's playing and everyone's inside with their doors shut. So you can see this kind of what Becky Nicolaides has described as bourgeoisement, right? Of a sense of upward mobility, of a reaching for a new kind of identity as homeowners that these Yiddish writers are then reflecting in their observations of their new neighborhood and almost lamenting the loss of community that they had seen in those other contexts. So yeah, I like to think of what we're trying to capture in this exhibit is that collision of aspirations, right? That somewhere in the middle is forged a history where there's these overlapping projects that are all kind of operating on the same space.
And I feel like a lot of what you all are talking about is making me think about those diverse place meanings in Boyle Heights, and both that people bring with them, everyone has a different memory, experience of this space, but also just kind of the diverse networks that both emanate outward as well as inward. And, you know, when I see your projects, I actually think of them as highly geographical because they provide insights into these neighborhood politics, but also these metropolitan networks and how it impacts this site. So I was wondering, as you entered these projects, were you all thinking about urban spatiality and movement? And what do you think we can learn about a place like Boyle Heights when we bring the West Side and the Valley and even some of these global diasporic movements into conversation through this neighborhood prism?
I'll start. I certainly felt that it was very important to give a sense that all of the people that came into Boyle Heights did not come in as empty slates. Mm-hmm. They came in with incredible experiences and traditions from wherever they were from. They had experienced, many of them, transitions from a rural agricultural society to an industrial society, or the ramifications of that. That's whether they came from the American South and African Americans, whether they came from Japan, often through Hawaii, whether they came from Italy, Eastern Europe, or Mexico. And they often came with very radical traditions from those places. Mm-hmm. They had been involved in union organizing. They had been involved in reading socialist writings. They had been involved in thinking about these, and they were walking into a Los Angeles, which was an open shop town. And therefore, they searched for ways of protecting the neighborhood, but also at work, getting more of those aspirations that Caroline was talking about, also led them to say, wait a second, we're not being treated fairly in work situations. Come the Depression, you see that coming to the foreground among people in Boyle Heights. You see people protecting each other in terms of getting thrown out, of not being able to pay their rent. You see that in terms of labor unions like the Lady Garment Workers Union, where Jewish and Mexican women work together, with Rose Pasota coming from New York to sort of get them organized in a very different way. So this is happening geographically, yes, but it's also important to understand the global nature of the transitions that were happening and how they came together in a place like Boyle Heights, where people were very interested in working across their various individual traditions into a larger tradition. And this is, I think, very important for Los Angeles historians to kind of grasp that people were not necessarily expecting somebody exactly like them, but a lot of the thinking that happened in a community in Boyle Heights came from people reaching back to the traditions that they had in their own backgrounds and bringing them forward into a place like Boyle Heights and creating essentially for Los Angeles the New Deal coalition that FDR would then count on to sort of fuel a kind of more of a democratic uprising in the 30s.
The efforts at coexistence that you document were striking to me, that there was so much, I found this when I interviewed people who lived in Boyle Heights at the time. Their memories are of my Japanese neighbors or the Latino kids I went to school with. They don't have like shtetl memories. They have coexistence memories. And you really go a long way toward documenting that. Was that, could you talk about that? Because it seems like there was both a unity of class as opposed to of ethnicity. There was it seemed like everybody kind of was in that same working class milieu. And there was these efforts. I saw that you had the DeSoto Jewish Center, which had, thousands of non-Jewish kids coming through there for education. A level of coexistence which simply, vanished in LA when that was gone. Can you talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah.
So go ahead, Caroline. Go.
Yeah, I just want to sort of quickly address both points. I mean, on the one hand, this exhibit is looking for overlaps and intersections in much the same way. As George is describing, these are a variety of diasporas that are converging in the same space and working to negotiate both ways to reinvent the familiar cultures of their home countries, but also ways to adapt them to the specific context of Los Angeles. And you'll see that in this Yiddish anthology that I've put in the chat. These guys are reaching for a California style, a voice that will reflect their specific experiences. And as I referenced before, Mapping Jewish LA is very much interested in those tensions between these sort of transnational cultural traditions and cultural forms and the local dynamics on the ground. So we try to show in this exhibit how there are parallel efforts within all of these communities. The example that always comes to mind for me that gets at what George was describing is the Worker Circle, right? The Arbiter Ring, founded in New York by a group who had been involved in the Russian Revolution in Eastern Europe and very much in dialogue with their comrades there. They come to Los Angeles, first branch is founded here in 1908. By the 1920s, there's 24 branches representing all sorts of ideological constituencies, from anarchists to English-speaking folks, the Walt Whitman branch, for example. There's libertarians, there's all sorts of varieties. There's a direct analog there to the Mutualistas, of which by the 1920s, there were 40 different versions in Los Angeles County alone. Some were tied to radical revolutionary movements in Mexico. Others were tied to church groups. Some were tied to the Mexican government. So these array of sort of, that my real interest is in that community building. How do you build community? How do we do that? How do we come to new places and find meaning in our lives and create spaces to imagine and debate and realize our own sort of visions of social citizenship and what it means to be an Angelino? To your question, Rob, I do often push back a little bit because I want to be sure that we honor how radical that kind of actual integrative work was. George mentioned before, this is an anti-union town. This is not just an anti-union town, this is a mass incarceration town, where by the 1910s, LA is home to one of the largest jail systems in the entire nation, as documented by one of my mentors, Kelly Lyle Hernandez. So this was really dangerous, radical work to bring people from various immigrant communities together in shared space to fight for more. The communists, for example, who I write about and love very much, we shouldn't underestimate how much heat they took for bringing folks together, and how aggressive the persecution was. The Cooperative Center, which is featured in the exhibit, one of my favorite institutions, was raided by the LAPD so many times that its shareholders ended up filing a first-of-its-kind injunction to stop the LAPD from raiding and destroying their center, which was a nightly occurrence. And they actually won that. It was the first successful injunction against the LAPD. So I don't want to, I think it's wonderful how much attachment folks have to that multi-ethnic history, to that environment of tolerance. But I want to emphasize that it took work to create that. It takes activism, it takes effort, it takes community building, and it doesn't just sort of ambiently happen in the atmosphere, right? And to honor the contributions that radicals and activists has made over the years. Someone in the Q&A references the CSO. I don't know if, George, you want to talk about that moment, but these moments of coalition are worth cherishing and elevating, because I think we all know in the present how difficult that work really is, to forge those coalitions, to maintain them amidst aggressive attacks against that kind of work. So go ahead, George.
I was going to say that most of the interviews that I conducted or I was involved in happened in the 1980s, 90s, early part of the 21st century. And that meant that we were interviewing people who had grown up as children in Boyle Heights through the 1930s and 40s. So this moves, the interviews themselves have to be seen in that light, i.e. these were children that had grown up at the height of the Depression and then had lived through World War II in the neighborhood. And that, I think, created a kind of bonding across groups that had not actually been present, even though the multiracialness had been there. It really took the community being under siege in the 1930s, the LAPD coming down, the thoughts that Nazis were in Los Angeles attacking the Jewish community, the anti-union activity of the 1930s, the repatriation of Mexicans, eventually Japanese internment. Everybody's seeing this happening in their community. Mm-hmm. So Boyle Heights was not immune from these other things, but that created a very different bonding experience for young people, particularly through Roosevelt High School, seeing that they needed to bond together, that they had something that was special. They were, in many ways, part of their aspirations, that they were the quintessential Americans. Mm-hmm. They were the ones FDR was pointing to and saying, we need you to participate in this war effort. We need you to fight back through unions. That was speaking to them individually. Mm-hmm. And so that created a very different kind of sense of a community responsibility in Boyle Heights for young people who, when they ventured outside of Boyle Heights, would not necessarily see this other places. Mm-hmm. Instead, they would see their own community being denigrated. There was just that disjuncture. Mm-hmm. So I think that it's very specific to what it meant to grow up in the 30s and 40s in Boyle Heights, and to see this, take pride in your neighborhood, but realize that was not being seen by the wider world. Instead, this community kept getting attacked by people outside of it.
Mm-hmm. Your statements make me think about, you all pay such careful attention to the politics and backgrounds that people bring with them as they enter Boyle Heights. And I love that, because I think it also makes us aware that when they leave to these communities, they are bringing something with them to those as well. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what politics did those who left Boyle Heights that had grown up there during this exceptional time. How did they impact other parts of Los Angeles as they moved out? And maybe vice versa, what happens as newcomers who come in who had not been exposed to that same period of radical politics or multiracial radical politics?
I just, before you answer Genevieve's question, I just wanted to add to it by saying it seems like what you were saying before is, it struck me in the exhibit that the radicalism hastened the demise of the neighborhood. Mm. So when Genevieve asked a question about what happened when people moved out, I just kind of wanted to preface that by asking you, what role did radicalism have in the redlining and in the destruction of, or at least in the exile of the diaspora of the Jews from Boyle Heights and of other people from Boyle Heights?
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to answer that question in two ways. First is to say that, just to second what George was saying, it really does feel like for so many folks who left, this was a seminal and formative moment in their lives. The example that's coming to mind right now is Judge Harry Pragerson, who was the first American Jew to serve on the Ninth Circuit of the Supreme Court. An incredible man. There's a lovely new documentary about him that I highly recommend. One of the things we surfaced in doing research for the exhibit is when he was president of the student body at Roosevelt during Japanese internment, when it just started. And he writes this sort of outgoing letter in the newspaper that basically says, we need to stand with our Japanese American friends. It's a rare glimpse of sort of how that experience felt for students. And he, of course, goes on to be an incredible steward of civil rights, of the rights of formerly incarcerated folks. He starts all sorts of foundations. And he really credits that time at Roosevelt High with having informed who he is. To get to your question, though, Rob, this is something that I sort of am looking at in my work as well, is how that radicalism, how that kind of specter of the Jewish Bolshevik, if you will, factors in redlining. So the language that's used by the Homeowners Loan Corporation in their assessment is diverse and subversive racial elements. Right? So not only does that accommodate for Black and brown communities that were in Boyle Heights, I think that's a reference to some of this radicalism that you're identifying, Rob, and how that becomes part of the neighborhood's reputation. An example I've been playing around with lately is a citrus strike in 1919, where a bunch of activists, Jewish activists, are living in a house in Covina, and the townspeople come to their house and deport them to Boyle Heights, right? So that association of race and space is really, really tight. And I think you're right to put a finger on that. But one of the things that is undeniably true is that at this moment, where mortgages are becoming almost impossible to find in the neighborhood, thanks to this assessment by the HOLC, when 5 freeways are being constructed in and around the neighborhood, as well as public housing projects that are displacing thousands of residents. I write about the Jewish Bakers Union. The first time I went to Boyle Heights, I round a corner to go to the address on East 1st Street, and what do I confront? It's the 10 freeway, just boom, right there. So it's hard to overstate how jarring that spatial reconfiguration really was. And I think it's important to note that the racial borders that were being imposed by those freeways were more porous for Jews. Who owed to the ambiguities of their racial designation, could sometimes sneak in under something like no non-Caucasians, right? That subjectivity affords them a degree of mobility at that moment that others in the community were not afforded. And what that means is that many of these institutions do relocate to other parts of town where they exist today. The Folkschule that we talk about in the exhibit is now located on 3rd Street. Their amazing library has actually just been donated to the Los Angeles Public Library to the efforts of Yiddishkeit, so shout out to them. The Worker Circle is now 3 blocks from me on Robertson Boulevard and has been there since the 50s. So, it's not that these institutions go away, but that they're reimagined in new contexts. I am proud and happy to see that there are some folks today who are doing this kind of work within the Jewish community today to keep these institutions alive and rethink about how to sort of organize the community in ways that have that same kind of radical civil rights forward kind of approach.
What I would add is that a couple of things. It's incredibly important to remember that as Jews are leaving Boyle Heights, particularly after World War II, they're entering new communities, the San Fernando Valley, the La Brea area, Pico Robertson, Fairfax, all that area, with 95% of the new Jews moving in coming from outside of Southern California altogether. So these are people that don't have a recognition of Boyle Heights, but they might remember Brooklyn, they might remember other places. That's who's dominating. And it's coming after World War II. So often they've first arrived here maybe as a serviceman, and now they're bringing their family to start a family here. But they're not coming with a history of thinking back on Boyle Heights. So increasingly, people who leave are entering communities, and then we end up interviewing them much later, and they say, I never was able to resurrect the kind of community I found in Boyle Heights, where I had a tight community. I knew people from lots of different backgrounds. We were students together, So there's a kind of nostalgia for Boyle Heights built into people who were here, and then recognize that the Jewish community just exploded in size, but mostly from people from the outside. There's one group of people who move not into Los Angeles, not to the west, but instead to the east. They begin to integrate communities like Monterey Park, Montebello, Pico Rivera. That group is interesting because it includes some of the most radical, like Leo Frumkin from my book, but it also includes Japanese and Mexican Americans who also left Boyle Heights. And what they're doing is they're integrating suburbs that had been hostile to all of them in the past. And they're fighting for integration in places like Monterey Park. These are the people that John Horton or Leland Saito will pick up in their works later on in the 60s and 70s. So it's really interesting to see this sort of movement out. At the very same time, what's happening in the post-war era is that these suburban communities are becoming more and more anti-communist, anti-radical, aggressively so. And so the Jews that end up staying in Boyle Heights, it's very important to know when they left, because if they stayed through the 40s and into the 50s, inevitably they tended to be more radical. They tend to be more leftist if you stayed. And so you see a lot of the most active discussions of Boyle Heights as a laboratory of democracy, and the CSO happening, the Community Service Organization to elect Ed Roybal, happening in the post-World War II period, where there is really active attempts to restructure politics and to become a kind of haven for a leftist politics that you didn't see other places in Los Angeles, as people were trying to fit in to a suburban white environment. And so I, for example, in my book, talk about the Committee for the Protection of the Foreign Born in Los Angeles, with Rose Chernin leading the efforts, but very much a multiracial effort in an organization that was very left, and they were trying to protect people from being deported in the 1950s, activists of all sorts. So I think it's really important to kind of realize it's a very dynamic process. And some of the last Jews that leave Boyle Heights really struggle with this, because they were there because of this community that they felt was disappearing in Los Angeles. And they battle with other parts of the Jewish community who have now sort of adopted a much more suburban white construct in terms of their lives, as opposed to what they saw as the more authentically Jewish community of Boyle Heights.
One of the things that was striking was, you know, we live in this landscape where we think everything is where it has to be. And you realize those freeways that cut through Boyle Heights didn't have to be there. So I wonder what the short answer is to, were they put there in order to punish Boyle Heights for being ethnic and radical?
Yeah, you know, I don't tend to put it that way, because I think that it's important to remember that the freeway designs come through multiple layers of state bureaucracy, right? But when you go to the Ed Roybal papers and you see the correspondence around, that was one of my favorite research missions as part of this exhibit, was seeing those documents, seeing how much community outreach was done. One of my favorite examples is this letter from a woman named Ava Gard, who's basically saying, look, I've lived in this same house since 1890. I don't want to be moved. This freeway design is going to pave over my house. Please don't do this. And you look at the extent of the signatures, and it's really unbelievable to see. What I would say, Rob, is that what the redlining maps gave for those policymakers who were making these choices about urban renewal is cover to choose neighborhoods where not only did they know they would face less significant political resistance, but also where they could make an argument about slum clearance. So actually, one of the first proposals to do slum clearance in the state of California is put forward by Augustus Hawkins, who runs on an EPIC party platform, which was a End Poverty in California, up in Sinclair's notorious 1934 gubernatorial run. Augustus Hawkins is a progressive, radical guy, and he's trying to clean up his neighborhoods. And so he puts forward a proposal that we do slum clearance in the state of California. Well, guess what the HOLC form identifies? Where the slums are. Right? So, you know, this is a moment where the American state is increasingly sort of rationalizing the process of this decision making and using things like a sort of rational process of assessments of mortgage loans to govern transit decisions. I know Genevieve can speak more about this because she writes about car culture in that way. But these were ultimately decisions to service the suburbs at the expense of the urban core. And the HOLC just provides a sort of map of where you can do that, because these are the slums, put your freeway here, you're not gonna have a problem. And what is surfaced in the Roybal papers is this incredible attempt, I mean, it's a failed attempt, by the community to say, hey, this is not a slum. You know, I've been living here since the 1890s. Like, come on, kind of response. And I will say, in one of those cases, Roybal's office is successful with the 60 freeway. George, maybe you can confirm this, where they essentially show those state leaders, actually, if you move this freeway 2 miles this way, you won't displace these 3,000 people. And so that's a battle they actually win. But, you know, I do want to say that these are multiple agencies and whatever, and I'll leave it there.
The other issue that I would add is that these battles are happening constantly through this whole period. So in 1935, Bill Deverell has shown that there's a map laid out of, in an ideal world, this is where we'd put all the freeways that we want to develop over the next 30 years. And there's 2 running through Beverly Hills. Those 2 were never built. So as people are complaining of how difficult it is to get to UCLA without public transportation, understand that this was planned by the city and by residents. There are 5 public housing units in Boyle Heights. The rest are all in South LA. There's one in the San Pedro area. There was supposed to be one in Westwood, but the people of Westwood rose up and said, we don't want public housing in Westwood. So that one was moved to Boyle Heights. And what happens is that all of the things where, Boyle Heights is seen as a place that you can step on. Mm-hmm. You can put a freeway through. You can put public housing in. And when LA famously moves away from support of public housing in 1952 because of a change of the mayoral election, not only do they send money back to Washington, D.C. for public housing, that money includes support for the public housing they've already built. Because at that time, they don't even want to support that. So what you end up with in the public housing in Boyle Heights is the only places that poor African Americans coming from the South at that time and braceros coming out of the fields, Mexican braceros, that's where they end up living in Boyle Heights, in very multiracial spaces now in the public housing units. But it ends up being that transforms Boyle Heights once again. And it's explicitly because other parts of Los Angeles have decided they don't want this. They don't want the freeways. They don't want the public housing. And they're able to rise up their voices and block those things from being built, even though the master plans included them. Mm-hmm. So I think that's really important to understand. Like when I think about, gentrification right now, mm-hmm. you have to deal with the fact that when other parts of LA don't want dense housing, when they want to continue to be zoned in single family homes, even though they're around subway stops, that's directly affecting not just them, but Boyle Heights. Because the people who are growing up in those houses there that can't repurchase, can't buy, can't rent even in the same neighborhoods they grew up in, they go looking for lower income neighborhoods to now rent in. So they end up in Boyle Heights. These things are intimately tied to each other. They always have been.
And it's so weird that, the exhibit doesn't really touch on this, but I guess the ultimate outcome of what you're saying is the Jews are moving back into Boyle Heights as gentrifiers.
Yeah, I think that's true to a certain extent. There has been some very nasty anti-Semitic imagery in the neighborhood along those lines. It's definitely a source of tension that it's urgent to address and sort of work through. I will say that it's important to acknowledge as well that some Jews never left, which is to say they retain their property. They become landlords in the neighborhood. So that's another dynamic that's functioning under some of these tensions, is that there's still a stake in that way of people taking rents from apartment buildings, from businesses, from what have you. But I do want to really emphasize George's point here, which is that the reaction you see to gentrification it's not specific to Jews, it's part of it, but it's more about these sort of generations of trauma that I think we need to honor and acknowledge. That this is a neighborhood that has for many, many years felt very disempowered from the forces that make decisions about its future and destiny. We try to document a little bit of the resistance there, which is to say, like the Madres de STLA, for example, who rise up against the attempts to build a women's prison in the neighborhood, who have fought against attempts to locate dumps in the neighborhood, and who have really led the charge against the Exide plant. That's maybe not a story everyone remembers, but incredible environmental justice activism coming from that group.
There were actually, There were actually a lot of questions about that, Carol. In the Q&A, I just want to, give people that there were a lot of questions in the Q&A about those coalitions, the coalition that helped get Ed Roybal elected, the coalition that I think you referred to it in some of your work, Genevieve, about the Jews helping Mexicans fight restrictive covenants. Mm-hmm. I kind of grew up in the shadow of the memory of those coalitions, and it feels like what you're saying is those, as Boyle Heights frayed, those coalitions frayed.
I think that's true and not true at the same time, is I guess I would say. I think there are many, many Jewish individuals and organizations working very, very hard today to fight in interracial coalition building, and I want to do honor to that. Certainly the CSO frayed, which is to say it has shrunk as an organization. I just need to say that I think that it's important that we understand the tenor of the activism today in a way that contextualizes, both sees it as part of this heritage of fighting for the rights of neighborhood residents, of fighting for community control over decisions about how urban space is used, where transit lines go, where police stations go. That kind of stuff matters. And I encourage folks in the Jewish community to join those efforts. One of the ones I want to point to in specific at this moment is the fight about the Cairo Senior Healthcare. If you'll indulge me a little bit of a plug, the former home of the Jewish Home for the Aged in Boyle Heights, the property that's on Boyle Avenue, is currently under threat. It was taken over by a Japanese American organization in the 60s and recently sold to a group called Pacifica that is attempting to evict the elderly residents there so that they can redevelop the property. So I'm going to put a link in the chat, but that's one small way that folks can sort of honor this memory and this heritage by getting more involved today. I really hope that's an outcome from this exhibit, is by peeling back the layers of these institutions and seeing that many of them are still alive and still serving the community today, that it might encourage folks to get involved in that way. And I'll turn it over there while I dig out the dig out the link. Go ahead, George.
The other thing I was going to say was that even though the community is overwhelmingly Latino at this point, there are still traditions of incorporating newcomers, which I think are fundamentally brought forward from the history. Now, they involve often new organizations like Mothers of East LA or Homeboy Industries that come from the neighborhood, but are incorporating undocumented people into local politics, non-electoral democracy, I would call it. That they want to protect the neighborhood. They want to make sure that there aren't toxic waste facilities nearby. There aren't prisons built. These are homegrown in Boyle Heights, overwhelmingly Latino, but they're drawing from traditions about bringing newcomers into the politics. And they're finding ways to include that. Homeboy Industries is a great example of trying to deal with a local problem of gangs in a very creative way, and to drawing from resources from the entire Los Angeles community to try to address that. Father Boyle's work there in that's now spread outside of Boyle Heights, but started there near Dolores Mission Church. So there are still traditions in Boyle Heights which are drawing from this larger history of welcoming newcomers, reaching across differences, and this time it's legal status that is the difference, to incorporate new kinds of politics that we need to pay attention to in solutions for reinvigorating democracy across Los Angeles. I think this is a very important part of what the contemporary Boyle Heights is bringing to us.
And you also, George, just to wrap up, you really see that as the legacy of the old Boyle Heights, this as a bastion of democracy and coexistence.
Absolutely. I mean, not only are people who, people sometimes will say, well, when I was in Boyle Heights, when I remember it way back when, this is what it was. But they have to look at the new Boyle Heights. At every generation of Boyle Heights seems to have the same kind of vigor for dealing with the problems of Los Angeles, the problems of citizenship, the problems of democracy in a new and interesting way. And that's why I think we can continue to learn from Boyle Heights today.
Yeah, it seems like there are these.
Oh, go ahead. No, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, I'm seeing this theme of these long history of displacements, the attention you're bringing to the state forces that cause that. Something that's struck me in this conversation too is the importance of the models of multiracial coalitional politics that are coming out of this place. And I know, George, from your forward and also conversations, that you actually taught a class at UCLA on Boyle Heights. And Caroline, like the Leve Center, has this educational mission that's very akin to that. And the public humanities aspects of your work, education seems to be and public conversation seems to be a big part of the work that you're doing. And I thought, as we start to wrap things up, maybe you can talk about how that has influenced your work and also your hopes for, like, why is it imperative to know about these histories? What are the best case scenarios out of knowing about these stories for current populations?
Yeah, well, I can start with that. I mean, it's one of the the interventions that Mapping Jewish LA is trying to make is that there just really isn't a lot of scholarship about LA's Jewish history. This is the second largest Jewish community in the country, the fifth largest Jewish community in the world, and yet the scholarship that's available is, there's just not a lot out there. I do want to give credit here and take this opportunity to acknowledge the efforts that preceded this exhibit, which is to say this would not have been possible without the pioneering work of the Southern California Jewish Historical Society, both to preserve the Breed Street Shawl and to collect people's memories and materials in the 1990s. That was incredible base of materials that we draw on here. Similar efforts were launched by the Japanese American National Museum as part of their Power of Place project. So I do want to acknowledge that this comes after many, many years of this work, and I don't think we're leaders here, rather building on legacies of other folks. I do want to say, though, that, you know, a lot of this history lives in people's basements and in their hearts and in their minds. And that's really, to me, the value of the work we're trying to do is foster inclusive modes of remembrance, of honoring the fact that a lot of this knowledge lives beyond the academy. It lives outside of Royce Hall, the beautiful building where I get to spend time in my office. And how can we, as scholars, nurture those relationships, reach out to provide folks information that they can use in a variety of contexts, speak to a variety of audiences, including graduate students and would-be scholars, but also, you know, people who teach at a synagogue school or at a local high school. Howard Shore reached out to me after he launched the exhibit. George may know that name. He was the first teacher at Roosevelt High to start teaching the histories of Boyle Heights to the students there. And that was just like the most magical thing, because it is that kind of public-facing approach that we believe is part of our mandate as a public university, is to foster a more open dialogue, to bring the community in rather than enforce these, you know, boundaries between the tower and Royce Hall and the outside world. So it is a inclusive mode of remembrance that aims to foster interethnic understanding, intergenerational understanding, and nurture the relationships between campus and the surrounding community. That's really the model that we're going for.
What's important to me, in addition to everything that Caroline just said, is also that we bring this history to Boyle Heights itself.
Yes.
People forget that because Boyle Heights is constantly bringing in newcomers, many of the newest people that have arrived at Boyle Heights don't know this history. They didn't grow up here. They're newcomers again from other places. And so it's so important to have a dialogue with the current Boyle Heights population about its rich history as a neighborhood, and not to assume that people who live there necessarily know it. So, you know, I've worked very hard over the last 20 years, not only to work with the Breed Street Show Project and the Japanese American National Museum, but also to work in Boyle Heights, bringing this history there in partnership with Casa 0101, Josefina Lopez's operation on East First Street in Boyle Heights. We have a Boyle Heights Museum where we've had 4 exhibitions already about Boyle Heights history. Before that, worked with something called History in a Box, sponsored by the Jewish Historical Society of Southern California, out of the Breed Street Show Project, where we basically helped 4th grade teachers in Boyle Heights incorporate Boyle Heights history, this diversity, into the teaching of California history in the 4th grade, in the community itself, with a box where you could take out various things and learn about the history. So finding new ways to reinvigorate existing neighborhoods, and particularly Boyle Heights, with this history itself is absolutely key to me if we want to sustain the drawing from history in these neighborhoods as we move forward in time.
Thank you. I want to thank all of you for sharing that history, and for, more importantly, sharing the lessons of that history with us. People have been asking in the chat and the Q&A where they could find more information. I'm sure the Leve Center website is going to carry this with all the sorts of information that you need and the links to it. I think I will probably carry it also on the Forward website, but if you want to see the links to all the information, please go to the Leve Center website. I think Caroline put some of those links on the chat. The Q&A had fascinating insights of people's personal stories, so I hope we could make the Q&A available. as well. I want to thank Caroline Luce. I want to thank George Sanchez and Genevieve Carpio. This was really, I could go on really for hours on this. I love this stuff. And I want to thank all of you for joining us. I want to thank the Forward. You can go on forward.com, sign up for our newsletter. If you want, you could even subscribe. And I urge you to buy George's book and look at the exhibit. There's so much more rich history there. Thank you all.
Thank you.